Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is Red Ice Radio. My name is Henrik Palmgren. We are based out of Sweden, Scandinavia, but you can follow us from around the globe at our website, redicecreations.com. And today we have a really interesting program ahead of us. We have Hugh Montgomery with us. He is the author of The God Kings of Europe, and his latest book is called The God Kings of Outremer. And we are going to talk about royal bloodlines. We are going to get into the descendants of Jesus a little bit and tie this together with some of the, I guess you could say, Scandinavian dynasties, the Udinic line and also another line called Ulvungar and much more. He has a blog that you can follow along in. To go there or to check it out, rather, simply go to hughmontgomery.blogspot.com. We will also have this linked up, of course, on redicecreations.com, so you can find the links easily from there. And we do have a lot to talk about today, and I'm really excited about this. So let's bring on our guest. Welcome to the program, Hugh. Very nice to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you for spending some of your time with me and our listeners here today. And maybe we can talk a little bit about your last name to begin with, and some of your family connections to the kind of research that we're going to discuss here today. I know that you've shared with me that the Montgomery line, who first came from Scotland, was introduced as nobility, I should say, in the Swedish, as we say up here, Riddarhuset, that the house of nobility in around, I think it was 1776. That's right, an interesting year there. So the question is, have you always been interested in this line of research, or was this something that came on later in your life, Hugh?
No, I think I've always been interested. I mean, I have to say I did a genealogy of my family. And in point of fact, at the time that I did it, I thought the Swedish line had died out. And it wasn't until I published the book and someone said to me, "But you finished it at Colonel whatever it was, Montgomery. Do you know that there are descendants still around?" And I said, "Oh, no, I don't." So someone gave me some addresses and I got in contact with them. And lo and behold, there they were. And in fact, not only that, but they are the most direct male descendants from Roger de Montgomery, who was the 2IC of William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings, and they are actually the most direct in the bloodline.
Okay, interesting. And a lot of, if we're going to tie this together a little bit with some of the sources, because this is again a very difficult area, I guess, to sort out, especially when we're talking about descendants of Jesus and so forth. There's so many different ideas, theories, and research around. And I want to get into a little bit what you base your research on. But as I understand it, you have a relative that himself were doing a lot of this research. Is that correct?
Indeed. Well, he's now dead. But Beau Gabriel Montgomery, who died a few years ago, in fact, back in the 1960s, I think it was, produced a book called Ancient Migrations and Royal Houses. And it was, in fact, when I went up to Sweden, and my Swedish cousin there very kindly gave me a copy of this book, and I started looking through it, and I realized that he'd done a lot of the work that I was looking at myself. So I then said, well, absolutely fabulous. Now, where did he get this information from? And lo and behold, I discovered that he had the most fabulous library with collections of documents and books and what have you, mostly about the Scottish lines and the family, but also the Belvoir and Arundel documents and so on, which are almost priceless, I would say. And it was on the basis of some of those that I was able to do a lot of the genealogies which I've done.
And how does one go about, digging into some of this material, and what are credible sources? Where do you go? I mean, again, you mentioned, of course, your relative have done a lot of his research here, but what do you know what he bases his research on?
Okay, his research was based mostly upon the Scandinavian documents, the Regis Danorum collection and the documents in the Royal Library in Stockholm and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So his was almost purely on the, if you like, the Norse side of it.
Yeah.
My side of it, if you like, or the bits that I have added to it, which is, if you like, the Palestinian, for want of a better word, side of it.
Mm-hmm.
Those come from a variety of sources. One of the documents, I mean, the first document I probably came across was a document that I didn't really take an awful lot of notice of, and I got this, 30 years ago, I think, or more, I came across it. And it was simply a rather nice little legend about Mary Magdalene, and I didn't think much more about it. And then, of course, the Nag Hammadi documents started to be published.
Mm.
And I realized that they were backing up what this document said. So I thought, that was interesting. Let's go and have a look at it. Now, you have to understand, I'm basically a medieval historian. I was professor of history, politics, and economics at the University of Applied Sciences in Belgrade. Sorry, my throat's going a little.
No worries.
And so it was, for me, to go back and look at sort of documents which go back before that, was something totally new to me. I mean, for example, I knew no Sahidic Coptic, and the Nag Hammadi documents are in Sahidic Coptic. I still wouldn't say I know Sahidic Coptic, but I can sort of, I would say, decode them, if that is the right word. I mean, I've got no idea how they're pronounced or anything like that, but I can sort of, after reading a considerable amount of them, I suppose I can decode them a little bit.
Right.
But, you know, it was a new thing for me, and I had to learn as I went along.
Absolutely, that's the way people learn. Obviously, how there are some other sources that you mentioned as well at the beginning of your latest book, The God Kings of Outremer, where you, for instance, mentioned Malachi Martin, even I think Henry Sinclair. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back there. If you like, the source documents are Eusebius, who wrote the history of the church from Christ to Constantine in the 4th century. Then there is the Abdius manuscript, which I mentioned in quite detail, and of which I now am the proud possessor of a complete copy, thanks to the curator of the Norris Collection in the United States. Mm. Now, you know, that has been sitting in there, God knows how many years, I've got no idea. It's never been translated out of Latin. Mm-hmm. And, you know, people just forgot about it. But there it is. And then there are other documents which, for example, Malachi Martin, who was a professor at a Jesuit professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, and he did translations, for example, of the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on. He wrote a book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Church.
Yes.
And in that, you know, he mentions quite clearly the Desposinae, who they were, the fact that they came to see Pope Sylvester and everything else. And, you know, it's not something I've made up. This is something that the Catholic Church itself acknowledges happened because it's been clearly written by people like Eusebius.
Interesting. And how far back can we go if we look at, for instance, then the genealogical record? If we look from various sources, how far back approximately does this go in history?
That is really a very difficult question because the first documents that I think that one can rely on is probably the Abdius manuscript, okay? Mm-hmm. Which was written somewhere around about 150 AD, and then was translated somewhere before 250 AD into Latin, okay?
Right.
Now, theoretically, the translator was a guy called Julius Africanus, but almost certainly he was not the translator. It was probably done by one of his scribes or something like that, but it was attributed to him. Just as, for example, you know, all the epistles
Yes.
So, but the important thing that we have there is that the guy who did the translation in the prologue says very clearly that Abdius was related to the Lord. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, unfortunately, he doesn't say how. If he did, it would make my life infinitely easier.
Right.
But the fact that he was related in some way or other means that he would know who Jesus' brothers and sisters are. And from him, we get very clearly that Jesus had a twin brother called Judas, known as Judas Thomas, or later on simply Thomas, which simply means twin, and another full brother called Jacob or James. And it also says quite clearly that, these were produced per carnum, by way of the flesh. In other words, Joseph and Mary had normal sexual intercourse. There was no question of virgin births. And presumably, if Thomas is a twin, then Jesus wasn't by virgin birth either.
Right.
It's a bit difficult. He also, of course, says that Joseph, Jesus' father, had another wife called Hannah, and by her he had Simon, known as Simon Hananias, or Simon the Petron, another Judas, or possibly Judah, who's usually known as Zelotes, and Thaddeus. So there was another 3 half-brothers of Jesus as well. Plus we know from the Gospel of Philip that he had a sister called Mary. So one can build up, if you like, a picture of his family.
Right.
Now the problem that we then have is we have no genealogy from that until the 8 people come to see Pope Sylvester in 318. Okay, so we've gone from, let's say, for the sake of argument, the year 80 AD, right?
Yeah.
To the year 318 AD. But we do know their names, because that's mentioned. That's mentioned by Eusebius. So what I tried to do is to look at what was the likelihood of who was descended from whom. To be perfectly frank, I haven't been terribly successful. I've made some suggestions, but there is simply, that is the most likely, but it's not by any means, I wouldn't put hand on heart and say, well, that's what it is, because you can't do that.
Right.
There are too many gaps missing. But I have done my best and said, well, that's what I think is the likelihood. And then there was another document, which obviously was which I actually don't think it was a different document. I think probably that Dr. Hugh Sinclair found the same document I have found and worked out his own genealogy from it, which, although similar to mine, does differ. Okay? All I have said is I've given what his genealogy says, I've given what I think it is, and I've suggested where the differences might lie and why they might be different.
Okay.
And I think mostly it's a question of names, and, for example, the name Thomas probably doesn't mean Thomas, it probably means twin, and Germanus probably simply means brother, rather than being a name.
Okay.
And I suspect that that's the sort of differences that we've got.
So it's not too much there, and as you say, this is very much about laying the puzzle, as it were, because a lot of these pieces are lost. Do you think that there are any? I mean, again, when the Nag Hammadi library were, discovered, so to speak, a lot of new information were brought to light. Do you think that we're ever going to see something like that again, where new reliable sources or documentation about this will come to